I still remember the day clearly. The day I realized I wasn't really part of my son's life anymore, at least not in the way I had believed. The invitations started arriving in the mail for friends, colleagues, and distant relatives. Colorful envelopes, perfect calligraphy, everything neatly arranged except mine. No card, no message, not even a text. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe the wedding planner had overlooked me. Maybe my son was waiting for a private moment to tell me. I convinced myself that I shouldn't jump to conclusions, that patience would reveal the truth in its own time. But as the days passed and I watched everyone around me post their excitement and their joy, I felt a small, persistent knot of worry in my stomach. Then I asked him directly. I called my son one quiet evening, heart heavy with anticipation and dread, and I heard it. Her parents deserve it more. Just like that. Not an apology, not a pause to consider my feelings, just a matter-of-fact statement delivered as if it were a simple fact about the weather. I remember sinking into my chair, staring at the floor, feeling the walls of my own home close in around me. I had raised him, nurtured him, stayed up at night when he was sick, cheered at his milestones, wiped tears when he failed. And yet, in this moment, all of that seemed irrelevant. His words were a sharp reminder that love, in his mind, could be measured by obligation, and that family could be selectively prioritized. For a long moment, I stayed silent. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. My instinct was to retreat into calm, to not give fuel to what I felt was a childish and hurtful declaration. I reminded myself that dignity, even in hurt, has power. But as I sat there, listening to the echoes of my own disbelief, I realized that silence, while noble, could be mistaken for weakness, that quiet strength could be easily overlooked by someone blinded by entitlement. Days passed. I kept my distance, though the sting of rejection was constant. My friends tried to comfort me, my siblings offered advice, but none of it could fill the empty space of absence that had suddenly replaced my role in the biggest day of my son's life. I began reflecting on all the moments that had led here, the subtle slights, the easy dismissals, the quiet devaluing of a mother's love. Every memory, once warm, now had a tinge of betrayal. And yet, deep inside, I knew I had a choice. I could let this break me, or I could observe, wait, and respond with clarity rather than emotion. Then the phone rang. I picked up, half expecting it to be another distant relative or perhaps just a telemarketer, but it was him, my son. And the voice on the other end carried a weight I hadn't anticipated, a tension that made my chest tighten before I even heard the words. "Mom," he said, carefully, deliberately, "we need you to cover $82,000 for the wedding expenses." The shock hit me like ice water. Not only had I been excluded from the celebration of his life, but now I was being summoned as a bank, as a provider for a milestone I wasn't even allowed to witness. My hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in years, I felt truly invisible, erased not just from joy, but from consideration. I couldn't speak at first. My mind spun, trying to reconcile what I had just heard. $82,000. The number echoed in my head, cold and unyielding. How could someone so close, someone I had loved unconditionally, treat me like this? Like I was nothing more than a wallet, a resource to be tapped when convenient. The anger bubbled quietly beneath the surface, but I forced myself to breathe, to respond with calm rather than a flare of emotion. I reminded myself, strength is not shown in shouting, but in measured decisions. After hanging up, I sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like an invisible fist. I thought of the wedding, of the laughter and tears I had once imagined being part of. My son, The boy I had raised from scraped knees to first heartbreaks had chosen to erase me from one of life's most sacred moments. The contrast between expectation and reality cut deep. I realized that the hurt was not just about the money, though that in itself was staggering. It was the principle of being dismissed, of having my love taken for granted and then monetized. I began to replay the conversations, the subtle shifts that I had perhaps ignored, the way he would avoid inviting me to casual gatherings, the way excuses were given for not stopping by, how easily his attention could shift elsewhere, toward others who had no right to claim the affection and loyalty that I had given freely. It was a painful realization, a pattern that unfolded before my eyes only now in full clarity. And yet, with clarity came resolve. I decided that this was not a story of retaliation, but of boundaries and awakening. The next days were filled with calls from family and friends, all of them expressing disbelief. They asked how I could remain calm, how I could let him speak to me that way. But in truth, my silence was my shield. I wanted to protect myself from saying words I might later regret. I wanted to observe, to let the situation reveal itself fully before I acted. There was a strange empowerment in restraint, a quiet strength that grew with each passing hour. And while the betrayal stung, it also illuminated a truth. Love can be unconditional, but respect must be earned and maintained. Then came the next shock. My son called again, this time with his wife's parents on the line. Their tone was familiar, warm on the surface, but threaded with entitlement. "We appreciate you," they said carefully, "but this wedding is expensive, and your contribution would make it perfect." My stomach churned. Perfect. Perfect for them, perhaps, not for me. The same walls of my home that had once felt safe now felt confining, a prison built of disappointment and unspoken expectations. I realized that in their eyes, my love and care were invisible unless accompanied by financial support. I reflected on my own life, on all the sacrifices I had made for this family, from late-night work to quiet encouragement to supporting dreams I hadn't fully understood at the time. It had all been offered freely, and yet here I was, now quantified into a sum of $82,000. The injustice burned, but instead of fueling rage, it fueled understanding. I saw the true lesson hidden in the pain. Sometimes love must be measured not by how much you give, but by how wisely you protect your dignity. After that call, I spent hours pacing my living room, thinking about every interaction, every memory I had with my son. I remembered his first steps, his scraped knees, the nights I stayed awake comforting him when he had nightmares. I remembered cheering the loudest at school plays, at sports games, at every milestone I thought would make him proud. And now, in this single moment, it all felt as if it had been erased, replaced by the cold practicality of money. The contrast between past warmth and present disregard cut deeper than I had anticipated. I decided I needed clarity. I needed to see if this was a momentary lapse in judgment or a pattern I had ignored. I began talking quietly to myself, recounting memories, noting behaviors, and observing the subtle signs I had brushed aside. Invitations that never came, holidays that became excuses, phone calls that were hurried or indifferent, all pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to assemble. With each recollection, I realized that this wasn't a sudden betrayal, but a slow unveiling of reality. The man my son had become was not the boy I had raised. He had been influenced, shaped, and sometimes blinded by others who had convinced him that my presence was negotiable. That evening, I sat by my window, candlelight flickering, the shadows dancing across the walls. I allowed myself to feel the hurt fully, to grieve silently. I cried, not in anger, but in recognition of the deep disappointment that comes when someone you love prioritizes entitlement over gratitude. But even in my sorrow, there was an undercurrent of power. I realized that the control they believed they had over me, the belief that I would immediately comply, pay the money, submit quietly, was illusory. My silence and observation were a form of strength they hadn't accounted for. I made a conscious decision not to respond impulsively. I would not give them the satisfaction of panic or compliance. Instead, I began documenting every detail, the dates, the conversations, the exact wording of each demand. Writing it down helped me process the emotions and gave me a sense of ownership over the situation. I could see the manipulation for what it was, a test of my limits, a push to see how much I would tolerate before asserting myself. And I knew then that the measure of a family's bond was not how loudly they called upon you in times of need, but how consistently they valued your presence, your love, and your dignity. Days later, I received a follow-up message from my son, filled with insistence and subtle guilt-tripping. "We're counting on you," he wrote. "This wedding can't happen without your help." I paused, staring at the screen, and felt a moment of clarity wash over me. I realized that my role in this situation was not to finance their celebration, nor to beg for acknowledgement of my value. My role was to decide what respect and love truly mean and to act accordingly. It was time to draw a line, to redefine the boundaries that had been ignored for too long. And so, with measured calm, I began preparing my response. It would not be harsh, nor would it be dramatic. It would be a statement of dignity, of self-worth, and of quiet strength, the kind that cannot be bought, coerced, or dismissed. In the midst of betrayal, I found clarity. In the shadow of manipulation, I found resolve. And though the pain lingered, I understood something vital. Sometimes the greatest lesson a parent can impart is how to protect oneself with grace and courage, even when the ones you love forget what that love is worth. The following morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup as if it could steady the storm in my mind. I thought about the phone call, the demand, and the silence I had maintained so far. Part of me wanted to cry out, to let him hear the anger, the hurt that had been simmering for days. But I knew that reacting with emotion would only feed the chaos and validate the idea that my love could be manipulated. Instead, I focused on clarity. I asked myself, what do I want to teach through this moment? What kind of parent do I want to be, even when faced with betrayal? I began to draft a letter, not to send immediately, but to organize my thoughts, my boundaries, and my feelings. Every word was intentional. I wrote about my disappointment, not as an accusation, but as an honest reflection of what it meant to be excluded from a milestone I had imagined sharing with him. I wrote about the $82,000 not as a request for justice, but as an example of how love and family support should not be measured in currency. I wrote about the subtle ways in which people, intentionally or not, allow entitlement to replace gratitude, and how those patterns, left unchecked, can erode even the closest bonds. As I wrote, I noticed a sense of liberation creeping in. Each sentence I put to paper felt like a step back toward myself, a reclaiming of dignity that had been challenged by the audacity of their demands. It was a strange paradox. Being excluded, being undervalued, had forced me to examine the strength I hadn't realized I still possessed. I realized that their insistence on control, their expectation that I would comply without hesitation, had given me an unexpected gift, the chance to define my own terms, to act not from reaction, but from conscious choice. Later that evening, I met a close friend for coffee. I told her everything, from the initial omission of the wedding invitation to the shock of the financial demand. She listened without interruption, her eyes reflecting both sympathy and admiration. "You're handling this with incredible strength," she said. "Most people would react with anger or desperation, but you're showing them that dignity cannot be bought or coerced." Her words resonated deeply. I realized that true power in moments of betrayal is subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. It is in the quiet, steady assertion of self-respect, in the refusal to let someone else dictate the value of your love. That night, I returned home and read over my letter again. I made a few adjustments, softening phrases that felt too sharp and emphasizing reflections on love, family, and boundaries. I wasn't writing it to hurt anyone. I was writing it to reclaim my own story, to assert that while love can be given freely, respect and consideration must be earned. I finally understood that this situation, painful as it was, had offered a mirror, a way to see clearly the difference between unconditional affection and blind obligation. It had taught me that empowerment comes not from confrontation alone, but from reflection, patience, and the courage to choose one's own response. And so, with a deep breath, I closed the notebook. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been at first. I felt something stronger, a quiet, unwavering sense of self, grounded in the understanding that love cannot be demanded, respect cannot be purchased, and true family bonds endure only when nurtured with honesty and care. The storm outside my window raged softly, wind whispering through the trees, yet inside there was calm. I was ready to face whatever came next, not with fear or desperation, but with dignity and strength. The next morning, I made my decision. I didn't need to confront anyone with anger, nor did I need to beg for acknowledgement or money. Instead, I called my son, my voice calm and steady, carrying the weight of every moment we had shared and every lesson life had taught me. "I received your messages," I began, "and I want you to understand something. I will always love you, but love cannot replace respect, and money cannot measure family bonds. I cannot provide what you're asking, not because I am unkind, but because this is about dignity, mine, yours, and everyone involved." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could feel him grappling with the words, trying to frame them as criticism, as resistance, but I held firm. I repeated, softly but clearly, that love is unconditional, but expectations must be reasonable, that family is built on mutual respect, not coercion or entitlement. I explained that while I had cared for him endlessly, I would no longer allow myself to be reduced to a bank account or a backup plan for someone else's convenience. Each word I spoke carried the quiet authority of someone who had endured pain, reflected on it, and emerged stronger. After I hung up, I felt an unexpected calm. The anger that had once roared inside me had softened into clarity. I realized that their reaction, their sense of entitlement, revealed more about their priorities than it did about my worth. I no longer needed validation from those who had tried to diminish me. I had reclaimed my story, my role in the family, and my own sense of self. For the first time in weeks, I felt free to grieve, to reflect, and to love without the fear of manipulation. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes. I saw the ripple effect of my calm and measured response. Family members reached out with genuine concern and support. Friends expressed admiration for the strength I had shown. And even though my son did not immediately apologize, I knew that the lesson had been planted. The understanding that love, respect, and acknowledgement cannot be taken for granted. The power of silence, patience, and self-respect had shifted the dynamics in ways no amount of shouting or pleading ever could. I often think back to that time now, the wedding I was excluded from, the shocking demand for $82,000. At the time, it felt like the world had turned against me, that betrayal had struck too deeply. But in retrospect, it was a pivotal moment, a test not of my finances, but of my patience, my dignity, and my courage. I learned that boundaries are not a sign of weakness, and that stepping back, observing, and responding thoughtfully can create a strength far greater than confrontation alone. And so, as I sit quietly by the window, candle flickering softly, I am filled with gratitude. Gratitude not for the wedding I missed or for the demand I refused, but for the clarity, wisdom, and resilience this experience gave me. I understand now that love, when mixed with expectation, can become a tool for manipulation. True strength lies in recognizing the difference, holding your ground, and valuing yourself enough to respond with grace, even when those closest to you falter, even when disappointment shadows your heart. The power to define your worth and to act from that place of self-respect remains yours alone, and in that, I have found my peace.